In 2015, a near-historic El Niño occurred that brought extremely favorable conditions for hurricane season across the East Pacific. This ultimately culminated in October of that year, where a small tropical wave would become a Category 5 hurricane in the span of 48 hours, but not just any Category 5 hurricane, the strongest hurricane in recorded history, Hurricane Patricia, with winds of 215 miles per hour before making landfall at a weaker intensity. This was the culmination of the hurricane season. In 2023, we had another big El Niño occur across much of the region, but unlike last time, things were a bit different. The Atlantic was far more active due to an increased PMM and increased water temperatures across much of the subtropical Atlantic that crushed the El Niño in its wake. But in that time frame, you had a situation where both the Atlantic and the Pacific were very active, culminating in October 2023, where in the span of 24 hours, a tropical storm turned into a Category 5 catastrophe for the citizens of Acapulco, Mexico, that being from Hurricane Otis. Now we're back to 2026, and we have a now potentially record-breaking El Niño developing, and already over the last few days, we have seen a pretty significant surge in tropical activity, and already over the last few days, we've seen multiple signs of very significant tropical activity going on in much of the Eastern Pacific, and that is just a sign for things to come. In this video, I'm going to be talking about why the Eastern Pacific is about to have a hurricane season for the ages. Alright, let's get started. So, to open things up, the East Pacific is going a little haywire according to the National Hurricane Center for right now. According to what they have, we have 5 areas of interest that are going on across the Eastern Pacific. And let's go ahead and pull up the NHC website and talk about it first. So starting off, look at this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 areas. To be fair, the majority of them have a low chance of development at this current point in time. However, we do have one glaring anomaly to that trend, and this one has a 90% chance of development. And so, we're going to go ahead and talk about this first, and we're going to go ahead and read this out. A broad area of low pressure located several hundred miles south of the south coast of southern Mexico is producing a large area of disorganized showers and thunderstorms. Environmental conditions appear favorable for gradual development of this system, and a tropical depression is expected to form during the early to middle part of this week, while the system moves generally west-northwestward well off the coast of Mexico. 40% chance of development in the next 48 hours, 90% in the next 7 days. So that's what we have going on over there, but right behind it, you have another area of interest that was just tagged not very long ago. It was just tagged a few hours ago at the time of filming this video. So we're going to go ahead and also talk about this one. An area of low pressure is expected to form by the middle of this week, several hundred miles south of the southern coast of Mexico. Environmental conditions appear conducive for gradual development of the system later this week, while it moves generally west-northwestward off the shore of Mexico. 30% chance in the next 7 days. And then you have these other 3 areas right here that are mainly staying off and out to sea over here, so definitely something to pay attention to. But overall, 5 areas of interest are across much of the Eastern Pacific, and that is definitely something you're going to want to watch out for. A couple of them are more so in the Central Pacific, particularly south and southwest of Hawaii, but holy heck, things are really starting to get cooking even as I'm recording this video, before I even get into this analysis for what's going on. So the main question that's going on now is, what is going on in the East Pacific? Why are things about to ramp up? And why are we going to see a hurricane season for the ages? And I'd say the biggest and easiest answer for that is the kind of El Nino that we are dealing with right now. Here is our region 1 and 2 index on the El Nino. We will also be looking at the 3 and 4 regions as well, but look at this. Regions 1 and 2, we are almost at 3 degrees Celsius above average, which is, at least for this current point, near historical highs for the El Nino and the ENSO region. What that typically means is an index like that is typically in what some would consider super El Nino territory, which is effectively a higher variant of the El Nino that we would typically see in the ENSO region. But regions 1 and 2, it's kind of been steadily increasing until recently when it started hovering around the 2.8 to 2.9 degrees Celsius above average range. But by and large, this is part of the reason you have that, because ultimately what ends up happening with a signal this strong is it also increases the water temperature substantially across much of the eastern Pacific, and you're also not dealing with as many trade winds, you're not dealing with as much shear in that part of the tropical basin as well. So that's your region 1 and 2. Let's go ahead and take a look at region 3 and 4. And damn, things are getting interesting over there as well. As you can see right here, by mid-April, we were still around the neutral phase before popping into El Nino territory, going into around mid to late April, and it's only been steadily increasing since then. And at this current point, we're at 1.75 degrees Celsius above average. That's a pretty strong signal even in that region as well. And if you average those two up, that's well over 2 degrees Celsius above average for the entire ENSO region, which is effectively reaching super El Nino territory in that region. So that's the first and most glaringly obvious reason why we're seeing such a very active hurricane season over there. But there's also a few other factors that we need to watch out for as well. We need to look at our water temperature and look at the conditions that are going on as well as give a diagnosis to see if this pattern is going to continue or not. And first off, let's go ahead and see our water temperatures across much of the eastern Pacific. They are, as you can probably expect, extremely warm. You're looking at some areas, especially along the coast of Mexico, of water temperatures exceeding 32 degrees Celsius, which would be almost 90 degrees Fahrenheit for those of you who do not use the metric system. A much broader area of around 31 degrees Celsius is also going on as well, which is about 88 degrees Fahrenheit, but this is the most glaringly obvious situation that you're dealing with in terms of your water temperatures. You're looking at insanely warm waters, not just in the eastern Pacific, but also in the central Pacific, where water temperatures along the Hawaiian Islands are reaching insanely anomalous highs, with those water temperatures around 26 to 27 degrees Celsius, which is about 78 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit over there. What we're dealing with at that current point is not just a situation where just the eastern Pacific could see a lot of activity, but also the central Pacific and potentially the Hawaiian Islands. And for those of you who are not familiar with the tropics in that region, allow me to explain this to you. The Hawaiian Islands are not known for seeing very big hurricanes or very big tropical cyclones impact their area. Part of the reason is because a high pressure system produces a lot of wind shear over there, and mainly due to much cooler waters than a bit further over to the east. But considering the fact that we are seeing water temperature anomalies several degrees Celsius above average in that region of the Pacific, on top of what's going on in the eastern Pacific off the coast of Mexico and in the prime main development region of that area, it's a very concerning situation to watch out for, especially if a system develops in the central Pacific near the Hawaiian Islands. And what I mean near, I mean a few hundred miles off the coast, starts to rapidly organize, get its act together. It'll have much warmer water temperatures to potentially sustain its development and sustain itself, bringing further impacts to especially the Hawaiian Islands if something is to develop and move into that region. And we've seen a few infamous hurricanes that have either directly or indirectly impacted Hawaii. I think the most infamous example I can give of recently was Hurricane Dora back in 2023. It didn't impact the Hawaiian Islands in a direct way. It stayed further to the south, but the wind shear and the high pressure system's winds that it did generate, that pressure gradient those two areas generated, caused a huge amount of wind impact across much of Hawaii, and that ultimately led to a single spark, resulting in one of the most destructive wildfires in the state's history, that being the Maui wildfire. Yes, tropical development has indirectly led to wildfire activity happening across the Hawaiian Islands. That's an underrated situation that not a lot of people talk about, but I just did. So that's kind of what we're looking at with right here. So that's your water temperatures. Let's also take a look at your ocean heat content on top of that. And here is your OHC, and that is pretty expansive, not just across the Pacific Ocean in general, but if you take a look and zoom in on the Eastern and Central Pacific over here, you're looking at a situation where you're definitely eclipsing well over 100 OHC in numerous areas right here, and that's definitely what you're going to want to pay attention to. That is considered what I would say, which is less technical, rocket fuel for hurricanes. For a good amount of strengthening to happen, anything over 50 OHC is pretty conducive for that. For rapid strengthening, 100 OHC is pretty conducive for that. Anything higher than that is considered what some would say on the less technical side, super fuel for a hurricane. And what that ultimately means right here, and for those of you who do not know what ocean heat content is, it's essentially a measurement of how warm your water is and how deep down does that water ultimately go. Think of it as a fuel tank, where the higher your ocean heat content, the larger your fuel tank will ultimately be for a tropical cyclone. And that's why we're paying attention to this, because the more OHC you have, the higher intensification potential you have for tropical cyclones, and especially in a basin like the Eastern Pacific, where you have a lot more water and you have a lot warmer water to deal with, especially this year. That's going to lead to some pretty scary situations, especially with anything that stays close to the coast of Central America and Mexico. So that's something else we're going to be paying attention to. But we're going to go ahead now and pivot over and look at our wind shear values and just kind of see what they are now and what they're going to be like, especially compared to the climatological mean. So here's what we got for you guys. Here's our European model. We're going to use the 0Z just to get a better range. Here's our 200 to 850 millibar wind shear right here. Relatively low wind shear across much of the Pacific Main Development Region. And what I consider the Pacific Main Development Region, and we'll go ahead and pull this map back up right here, is anywhere in this area where you're seeing 29 to 30 degrees Celsius water temperatures right here. That's what I would consider your MDR for the Pacific, mainly due to the warmer waters and the fact that the wind shear, at least for right now, is mainly remaining relatively weak. So that's what we got for you guys over here. But here's our forecast over the next couple of weeks. Remains relatively quiet across much of the Eastern Pacific, mainly staying concentrated in the Gulf region and in the Caribbean as well, which we've definitely discussed ad nauseum before. But overall, what you do have some shear starting to move into parts of the region right here. We're going to see some potential impacts, but it remains relatively light, especially as tropical development is anticipated in this region of the EPAC. But overall, what you are seeing is any shear that does move into there remains there for not a long amount of time. It remains there for maybe a couple of days at most before either moving further to the west or moving back into the Atlantic. And then as we get to 6 days out, which would be July 17th, you have a situation where you have another area of low shear. You're seeing a lot lower shear in a lot more areas across much of the Eastern Pacific over here, and that's going to lead to some stronger development chances as well. So ultimately, you're looking at this, and you do see a little bit of shear starting to pop up over here, but there is a bit of a misconception with this, especially as it's attached to this low pressure system over here. What hurricanes typically tend to do is when you start seeing a tropical cyclone starting to develop, at least on the wind shear maps, they kind of confuse you a little bit. They bring up stuff that is quote-unquote shear when it's actually the system producing its own wind field. So that's just a misconception I want to address right there. It's no, the system's not being sheared to oblivion. It's producing enough winds, especially in all levels of the atmosphere, where it's producing its own quote-unquote shear. So I wanted to clear that up. I wanted to kind of talk about that as well. But overall, the shear that you do see impacting parts of the Eastern Pacific doesn't stay there for very long. It only stays there for like 3 days at most in a lot of this right here, and it remains relatively weak across much of both the Eastern and the Central Pacific as well. So that's what we have going on over the next couple of weeks. Let's go ahead now and talk about what's going on with the dry air, because yes, you got good wind shear over there, but what's the dry air aspect going to be like, Patrick? And here's the answer to that question, ladies and gentlemen. And the answer to that is, what dry air? What dry air is over here? Yes, there is some going on in parts of the Central Pacific over here. There is a little bit in the Eastern Pacific, but it's a lot more mixable. What dry air are we dealing with? And ultimately, that's going to lead to a situation where you have more chances of tropical development. You already have 5 areas of interest across the Eastern Pacific for a reason. And the moisture that you are dealing with is just going to keep coming and coming and coming over here, ladies and gentlemen. And yes, you do have a little bit of dry air going on off the coast of Mexico, but it's what I like to call mixable dry air. What mixable dry air is any sort of convection that can get its act together and then moves through this, as long as there's not a lot of wind shear, can ultimately mix out a lot of this dry air. It's not going to be too big of a factor. Heck, even outflow boundaries could definitely mix that out from a tropical cyclone. We've seen many examples of that doing that. Hurricane Laura is always the one that I use. That's the example I always use back in 2020. But ultimately, the dry air aspect of it, there's not very much dry air until we get to maybe in this part of the Pacific Ocean over here in the Eastern Pacific. But by and large, that's not necessarily too much of a difference over there until it gets, at least this area of low pressure over here, gets to about 20 plus degrees to the north as well. And then you're having another system in a very big moisture pocket right here that just continues to go on and on and on. And as time continues to progress, ladies and gentlemen, that moisture just keeps getting replenished more and more and more as more convection moves into the region. And by and large, your dry air problems are a lot less here than what they would be, especially in the Atlantic with the Sahara air layer. The Sahara air layer doesn't really expand into the Eastern Pacific. It mainly stays in the Atlantic. There have been a few notable instances where that has not been the case, but that's a topic for another day. But overall, ladies and gentlemen, what you have here is what I like to call prime conditions for tropical development. You have really warm waters across much of the Eastern Pacific. You have a lot less wind shear than you would typically have for this time of the year to work with. And you have a pretty significant dry air aspect of it where there's not much dry air, and instead there's a huge amount of moisture that's going to continue to infuse more and more and more as time continues to progress. But what's the long term going to look like, ladies and gentlemen? What is it going to look like, say, in a couple of months? Say we get to October, similar to what you saw with the intro with Patricia and Otis. What's the climate going to look like at that current point? Well, we'll go ahead and talk about that in just a second, but before we do, I also want to emphasize the wind shear anomalies that are going on across much of the EPAC. Definitely pretty curious, I will say. It's interesting to take a look at it and go, okay, you're still looking at shear. It's definitely above average for right here. But considering the fact that you're not seeing that much wind shear, if you look at the wind shear map by itself, once again, let's go ahead and pull this up for you guys. It's definitely some pockets of wind shear overall, but they remain relatively isolated, especially off the coast of Central America over here. But as time progresses and as you're going to see that go on, those anomalies most likely will dip. And we'll go ahead and show the CFS monthly just to kind of emphasize that right here. Here is our wind shear anomalies for you guys right here. Yep. By the time we get to August right here, you are going to see an increase of shear across much of the Eastern Pacific. So maybe you have a little bit of a lull period going on around that time. But as we move into September and potentially October, that starts to change a little bit. as you're looking in September right here, ladies and gentlemen, you have a pretty big wind shear pocket right here of much lower anomalies. You're looking at a lot lower over here in much of the eastern Pacific. This is an entire synoptic region that you're seeing that. And then as we get to October, those anomalies start to increase and start to shift further up to the north, closer and closer to Central America and closer to the Mexican coast as well. So that's going to be a pretty big shift, especially going on the next couple of months. Because right now what we're seeing is, yes, you are going to see more shear than average, but that's to be expected. It's still July. You're going to see those periods of shear go up and down, up and down, up and down. But by and large, for right there, it's definitely a situation that you're going to want to pay attention to. And then just for curiosity, what's November going to look like? Yeah, that's when you have your season start to slam shut a little bit across much of the eastern Pacific. Those wind shear anomalies really start to whip back up as winter weather starts to impact much of the United States. But overall, pretty healthy area of low wind shear across much of these regions right here that we're going to be paying attention to. So that's kind of what we're looking at. But I also want to look at our moisture anomaly. What's our total precip anomaly is going to look like? Starting in August, as you can see, it's a lot drier across much of the eastern Pacific over here than averaged going into August. So this to me looks a little bit interesting. To me, this appears to me that one of two things is going to most likely happen with this pattern. Either A, the development that does occur is either going to stay further to the south or in the central Pacific, at least early on, or B, we're going to have a lull period, at least for going into August, where you don't see too much happening in the eastern Pacific. And hey, maybe the Atlantic could do something in that time frame. That's just a little bit of speculation. We talked about that on the Triple P show. But ultimately, August is not very favorable for tropical development across much of these regions off the coast of Central America and Mexico. But as we start to shift into September, those fortunes do start to change a little bit. You're seeing those dry anomalies start to get below average. And then as we get to October, ladies and gentlemen, that is a big switch flip right there. And ultimately, you're seeing some of these anomalies, especially getting up to even as high as 12 inches above average in some of these regions. That tells me that you're going to have a much stronger area, especially going into late September and October, where you have a higher potential for tropical development, especially right off the coast of Mexico, and potential impacts will be possible. Let's also, though, go ahead and take a look at things. I want to look at our main sea level pressure anomalies across the Pacific. And as we go ahead and start with August right here, things do get a little interesting. If you're on the coast right here, you're either at slightly above or around average in terms of your pressure. What this basically registers for me right here is this going to be stormier? Is there going to be a higher chance of tropical development than average in terms of low pressure or not? And at least according to the Eastern Pacific at large, the answer to me appears to be yes, especially even going into August. And then as we go into September, a lot of those high pressure anomalies start to decrease right here, while these low pressures start to move closer and closer to the coast. And then October, we are looking at a very violent swing from above average to below average across not just the Pacific, but the Atlantic Basin as well. So it's definitely an intriguing situation that we're going to want to watch out for as well. And it appears to me that, at least for right there, October of this year is going to be a rather, dare I say it, violent time in terms of the East Pacific hurricane season. Because to me, it looks like, based on both the moisture and the wind shear on top of the low pressure readings right here, at least compared to the climatological mean, you're going to see a massive flip switch. Like, this is probably the most dramatic flip switch of hurricane season that I have ever seen, and I have been doing this since 2015. So overall, the main takeaways for what I can say from the East Pacific are a few things. Number one, the period that it has right now in July is going to have a pretty good shot of tropical development. So short-term tropical development is very likely at this current point, especially over the next couple of weeks. The second point is that it looks like to me that you're going to have a little bit of a lull period going into August and throughout the first half of September. And the main reason for that is going to be the wind shear and the dry air aspect of it. The dry air anomalies are absolutely going to be insane right off the coast of Central America and Mexico, especially in August. And that's when I would expect a lot of dry air to move in there. Not very much tropical development is going to potentially happen, and if it does, it's mainly going to stay concentrated in either the southern part of the Eastern Pacific or in the Central Pacific Oceans, where the Hawaiian Islands could potentially be threatened. Which, by the way, side note, the Hawaiian Islands definitely are in a higher risk this year than they have been in years past, and I want to emphasize that very quickly. And the last point I want to make, and the last takeaway I would say here, October is most likely going to be a potentially violent month for hurricane development in the Eastern Pacific. You have your moisture anomalies flipping, you have lower wind shear, especially closer to the coast, and you have your pressure anomalies flipping like a switch. And these aren't small swings either. These are very dramatic shifts, literally going from 12 inches below the precipitable water mean to 12 inches above in terms of your total precip. That is not a small swing by any margin. That is one of the largest swings in terms of moisture content that I have ever seen. And that is something that we're going to need to monitor on top of the wind shear and on top of the pressure, as well as the amount of vorticity that could potentially be coming into much of the Eastern Pacific, mainly off the Central American gyre. That is something that's not really talked about a lot. But that's going to be something that we'll talk more about in another video. But overall, we're in for a pretty historic hurricane season, and dare I say it, a hurricane season for the ages in the Eastern Pacific. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, especially if you are new. The goal, as always, is to get more people engaged with weather. If you'd like to help us out and if you'd like to see some behind the scenes or hang out with us, feel free to join the Storms Unite Discord server. The link to that will be in the end screen. And with that being said, have a wonderful day, guys. Stay safe.